The French Revolution promised to break the chains of tyranny and deliver freedom to all of humanity. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Words that still echo through every democratic constitution ever written. But the men who stormed the Bastille, who toppled a king, who rewrote the entire moral architecture of the Western world, built a guillotine for the women who took them seriously. The same men who signed the Declaration of the Rights of Man decided that a woman's intellect was a crime against the state. They called her dangerous. They called her unnatural. They called her a traitor to her sex. And then they cut off her head. That is the story they wanted you to hear, the one where she is a footnote, a cautionary tale, a woman who got above herself and paid the price. But the truth behind the smoke of the Paris guillotine is a political thriller of betrayal and intellectual courage, where a woman had to be more audacious than the revolutionaries themselves to remind the world that rights have no gender. And the most extraordinary part of the story is not that she died for it. It is that they needed to kill her, because her argument was unanswerable. Welcome back to Medusa Awakened, where we unearth the voices they tried to bury. She was not born Olympe de Gouges. She was born Marie Gouges, in Montauban, in 1748, the daughter of a butcher and, according to some accounts, the illegitimate daughter of a minor nobleman who never acknowledged her. The illegitimacy was not incidental. It shaped her understanding of how systems classify people into those who count, and those who are counted only when they are needed. At 17, she was forced into a marriage she later described as the tomb of trust and love. A husband she did not choose, a domestic life designed to the specifications of other people's expectations, and a world that had already decided the outer limits of what she was permitted to become. Then her husband died, and Marie Gouges made the only decision that mattered. She refused to remarry, she took her son, and she went to Paris. She reinvented herself entirely. The name Olympe de Gouges was not an affectation. It was a declaration of independence, the first of many she would make, and the least dangerous. In Paris, she entered the intellectual circles of the Enlightenment, the salons where philosophy was not an abstract exercise, but a live weapon being aimed at the foundations of the old order. She could not read well when she arrived. She taught herself. She absorbed everything. Rousseau, Voltaire, Condorcet, the debates about natural rights and the social contract, and the radical proposition that legitimate power must rest on the consent of the governed. And then she picked up a pen. Her plays were incendiary. In 1785, she wrote a work called Black Slavery, which demanded the abolition of the slave trade in the French colonies, at a moment when the entire Parisian bourgeoisie derived its prosperity from it. The Comédie Française suppressed it for years. The aristocrats were furious. The merchants were furious. She had understood something that most of the male philosophies had conveniently overlooked, that a revolution of human rights which left enslaved people in the colonies and women in the domestic interior was not a revolution at all. It was a reorganization of who got to hold the whip. She was not going to pretend she had not noticed. They never forgave her for that. And they had not yet seen what she was capable of. The pen was already loaded. She was just waiting for the right target. In 1789, the Bastille fell. The streets of Paris ran with the energy of a world being remade from the foundations. The National Assembly drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that would shape modern democracy for centuries. It was magnificent. It was also written by men, for men, about men. Article 1 stated that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The word home in French carries the philosophical freight of universal humanity. And the revolutionaries knew exactly what they were doing when they chose it and left it to stand unqualified. Women had fought on the barricades. Women had marched to Versailles in October 1789 and dragged the royal family back to Paris at knife point through rain and mud over 12 miles, in an action that arguably saved the revolution at its most vulnerable moment. Women had sustained the revolutionary economy with their labor, their networks, their clubs, and their courage. And the National Assembly looked at all of this and produced a founding document that did not include them. The exclusion was not an oversight. It was a decision. In 1791, Olympe de Gouges responded, not with a petition, not with a letter of protest, with a mirror. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, structured article by article as an exact counterpart to the original declaration, replacing home with femme at every turn. Article 1. Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. Social distinctions can be based only on the common good. The text was not the work of a hysteric or an eccentric. It was a precise, legally literate, philosophically rigorous exposure of the central contradiction at the heart of the revolution. She asked one question in different registers across 17 articles. If the principles of natural rights are truly universal, on what rational or moral grounds do you exclude half the human species from their application? There was no coherent answer. There never has been. There is only the sound of men changing the subject. And that is exactly what the Jacobins did, with exceptional and deliberate violence. She did not write a complaint. She wrote an indictment. By 1793, the revolution had devoured its own moderates. The Girondins had been purged. Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety had seized control and inaugurated the period history would call the Reign of Terror. The guillotine operated daily in the Place de la Révolution. Suspicion was the currency of survival. Denunciation was social strategy. Every intellectual who had not perfectly aligned themselves with the Jacobin program was a potential enemy of the people. The rational response to this environment was silence and compliance. Olympe de Gouges chose neither. She wrote a pamphlet attacking Robespierre directly by name. She called him a tyrant. She argued that the revolution had transformed itself into a machine for producing corpses and dignifying the process as justice. She proposed a national referendum on the form of government France should take. A direct democratic challenge to Jacobin authority at the precise moment when challenging Jacobin authority was a capital offense. She understood what she was doing. She understood the risk she was taking. The pamphlet was the act of a woman who had decided that the argument mattered more than her survival. A decision that is philosophically easy to admire and almost impossible to actually make when the guillotine is audible from your window. She was arrested in July 1793. She was held in isolation for months. She was denied legal counsel, which was itself a violation of the revolutionary principles the Jacobins claimed to be defending. In the Revolutionary Tribunal, she was accused of producing seditious writings and of being an enemy of the Republic. She defended herself. Without preparation, without an advocate, without a single ally in the room, she argued her own case with a composure and a precision that the tribunal found deeply inconvenient and entirely irrelevant. The verdict had been decided before she entered the room. The trial was the performance. Her guilt was the predetermined text. If you believe history has been manipulated to silence the minds that dared to challenge power, subscribe to Medusa Awakened. These voices do not tell themselves. Let's rewrite the narrative together. On the 3rd of November, 1793, Olympe de Gouges was taken to the Place de la Révolution. She was 45 years old. She had spent months in prison without trial, without counsel, without the rights that the revolution had promised were the birthright of every citizen. She climbed the steps of the scaffold without the performance of contrition the crowd expected. She had written, years before her arrest, a sentence that has outlasted everything the revolution believed it was building. If a woman has the right to mount the scaffold, she must equally have the right to mount the rostrum. She had written it as argument. Now it was biography. The newspapers of Paris reported her execution as instruction. The Moniteur Universel described her as a woman who had forgotten the domestic virtues that were the true glory of her sex in order to pursue politics. The word politician was not description. It was conviction and sentence and epitaph. Her writings were not preserved. Her plays fell out of circulation. Her declaration was not taught in the schools of the Republic that had just killed her for writing it. For more than a century, she existed in the footnotes of official history as an eccentric, an irritant, occasionally a warning about what happens to women who forget their place. The men who killed her understood something true about how historical memory is constructed, suppress the primary sources, control the narrative of the aftermath, and the person eventually disappears from view entirely. They were almost right. They cut off her voice at the source. The text survived anyway. They silenced the woman. The words refused to go quiet. She did not disappear. Scholars of feminist political theory recovered her texts from the archives where they had been buried under the accumulated weight of official indifference. They found the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and recognized it for what it was, the founding document of the argument that human rights are indivisible or they are merely privilege wearing the costume of principle. They found the woman behind the texts and recognized what the revolution had executed, not a footnote, not a victim of her own ambition, but a political philosopher who understood in 1791 what the architects of the revolution refused to acknowledge, that a republic built on the selective application of universal rights is not a republic. It is an oligarchy with better marketing. Robespierre sent her to the scaffold. The terror buried her name under a century of silence. And yet here we are, saying her name. They cut off her head to silence her pen. The Declaration of the Rights of Woman is still read. Her question is still waiting for a complete answer. And every time a woman enters a parliament, argues a case in court, or stands at a podium and speaks without asking permission, she is climbing the rostrum that Olympe de Gouges insisted she had the right to climb. They tried to deny her the rostrum. They could only give her the scaffold. And the echo of what she said from those steps has carried, across 2 centuries, further than anything they built to silence it.